If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is Politically Speaking. When Missouri lawmakers return to Jefferson City this week for the 2024 legislative session, they'll be entering an environment of very low expectations. But State Representative Aaron Crossley believes that even though it's an election year, both parties could find common cause with helping the state's child abuse investigators. The Independence Democrat joins us on the latest episode of Politically Speaking to discuss the 2024 session and what the two parties are expected to battle over. Let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
My promise to St. Louis was that I would do the absolute most for each and every person, starting with those who have the very least.
What I wanted to do was look and see what other states are doing.
We have to be willing to change those laws, that they are balanced and they affect everybody equally.
As somebody that grew up in the St. Louis area in North St. Louis County, I didn't know any lawyers growing up.
We got to find long-term solutions to make government better, but also to be able to provide services to people.
I don't want to leave that federal money that we've been leaving all these years on the table.
We need to be spending this money to take care of Missourians.
I thought we accomplished a lot this year, but a lot more needs to be done.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I am your host, St. Louis Public Radio political correspondent Jason Rosenbaum. Joining us from the home of former President Harry S. Truman, Independence, Missouri. Our special guest today is
Aaron Crossley. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us for the first time. Before we ask you multiple biographical and state legislative questions, can you just tell our listeners what the boundaries of your district are?
Absolutely. Yeah, I usually say Southern Independence, so anything south of 23rd Street down to the Kansas City Independence line.
One of the things I've noticed about Independence in terms of its politics is that it used to be a very Democratic area, mentioned before, for the home of like the only president to come from Missouri, Democrat Harry S. Truman, but it's become kind of a swing area in the last couple of election cycles. Why do you think that's changed over the years? I'd be interested to hear from a Independiencean himself.
Sure. I don't know exactly what our demonym is, but yes, as an Independencian, I don't think that really independence has changed all that much since Harry Truman was here. Harry Truman was kind of a figure that was conflictual in his different beliefs, and is upheld for desegregating the military, but then also has some questions on other things they did, like dropping the bomb on Hiroshima. And so I think my district is pretty much split down the middle. It's 48% Democrat, 48% Republican, 4% Independent / moderate, and so we are used to having to get along. When I look to my neighbor to my left or to my right, I know that they have different viewpoints than I do, some of them, but at the end of the day, we've gotten used to having to talk to each other. And I think, honestly, independence has a lot to teach the rest of Missouri and the political system and how to have conversations again.
I was reading an article from the Kansas City Beacon, and it mentioned that you are a former Republican turned Democrat. What made you switch?
I always say that relationships made me kind of switch, and I don't think that I have really changed that much from my upbringing. My parents instilled in me the value of hard work, of hospitality and service to others, and those are still positions that I have brought into my middle-agedness now. And in fact, I think that same article mentions that my dad was a Republican that ran in Jackson County at the same time that I did, and he ran in House District 34 while I was running in House District 29. I as a Democrat, he is a Republican, and we still have Thanksgiving and Christmas on the calendar for every year still. And again, I think that was an experience that also taught us how to have conversations and made us recognize that we have much less difference in common than we do similarities. And oftentimes we all want the same thing, but we just have different viewpoints on how to get there. So I think the more that I learned about the world, I work in healthcare. I'm a social worker. I am well trained in how different systems impact the people that I have served in social services. And so for me, the Democrat Party more aligned with that. Its emphasis on workers' rights, its emphasis on making sure people have what they need, and then getting the government out of the way. That's why I became a Democrat. But again, I think we have a lot to learn from each other.
Okay, you stole my thunder about your dad running in another district. J.C. Crossley. He narrowly lost to State Representative Kemp Strickland, who's a Democrat from Lee's Summit.
Mm-hmm.
I just got to ask, how weird was it, you running in the same cycle as your dad, and you were running in different parties, and he was just a few dozen votes away from serving in the legislature with you on the other side?
Right.
Like, I've never heard of a scenario like that in Missouri politics before.
Yeah, I would say at first I was surprised. That's not something that he had ever talked about, but I hadn't been thinking about running my whole life either. I think at first I thought it might steal a lot of attention and get some media attention, good or bad. But that article that you referenced really is the only one that I know of out there that did. And I think the fact that we continued in civility, it didn't get the clicks that it would have if we would have maybe been more vocal. But again, love him as my dad, and I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And I support anyone that wants to get engaged and make a difference in their community.
But I do want to talk about your race, because your race was pretty competitive. And what was really interesting is your Republican opponent, and I had checked one of my favorite websites, Our Campaigns, which has like the election results of every election ever done. And your opponent, I think his name was David Martin, if I'm getting that correctly.
Correct.
He had run in unwinnable districts for Republicans for several election cycles. He got like 10% of the vote against now Senator Barbara Washington. Right. But then he's running against you in a 50-50 district. He gets like $70,000 from the House Republican Campaign Committee, and he is suddenly a very credible candidate. What was it like running in that race, knowing that this was a targeted seat that Republicans wanted to take back? And even though you were running for the first time, this was not like you running an independence district in 2004. Like, this was a very competitive race which Republicans wanted to see you lose.
Yeah, I think if I remember the math, I think my district had the third most amount of money from the House Republican Campaign Committee put into it across the state. At the end of the day, I think it comes down to just kind of what my opponent and I focused on. I noticed my opponent tended to focus a little bit more just on what party he was a part of, and I didn't run to represent just Democrats or just Republicans or just one group or the other. I ran to represent everybody. And so as I went door to door for months, I made 2 laps around my district and really got to know people at the doors. And so my favorite line at the door is just to ask people what they care about. And if, I don't stop at the first thing that they mention. As a social worker, I'm used to digging down deep and really trying to help people figure out and say what they really care about. And at the end of the day, I think people care about being listened to. And I think that made a difference in my race, is that I didn't run, although I'm a proud Democrat. I'm on the Jackson County Democratic Committee. I'm on the state party. I ultimately care about representing people and digging deep and figuring out what they actually care about.
So one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is I saw on Instagram that you had been interviewed by KSHB 41 in Kansas City about the tragic death of Grayson O'Connor. And you said to the reporter that this case showed that Missouri needs to get more serious about hiring more investigators at the Children's Division that look into abuse and neglect. And I want you to explain why you think that's the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, the story of Grayson O'Connor, just to give your listeners some background, it was just early on in December, he fell from a 17-story window in downtown Kansas City from his home and was found dead on the ground there. And as the police, entered the apartment, they found his mom there, and the window open. And it sounds, from what I've heard, the windows are difficult to open, so it would have taken some measure of strength to be able to get that window open. And as a parent, I have myself as a dad of two kids, it's an issue that I take personally. And so I think as we hear more stories like this, I think I've heard it referenced as kind of the nightmare scenario of just kids being found completely in neglect. Earlier this year, there was another kid that was in the news, Jaden Robker, who was found dead in a pond nearby his home. And Children's Division had been involved. The state had come in and had reports made, but had failed to do an investigation until he was missing, and then didn't find his body until a couple of weeks after that investigation started. And so I think that there's more that we could do, because clearly what we're doing right now is not working with stories like that in the news.
So from reading articles about this case, there was a call made to the state's child abuse hotline in 2020, and there was also another visit by police, I think earlier this year. Do you have any details, or do you get any insight from the Department of Social Services or the Children's Division about whether there was any investigation that uncovered any credible evidence of abuse?
I don't have all the details because the investigation from the state is still pending, so I'm not privy to those details, just like the rest of the public is not. What I do know is that the state had made some contact with the family. Neighbors in the apartment building had called the child welfare hotline and made reports. I've seen video of that a neighbor took of screaming coming from the apartment. So the state had been involved, but the state right now, kind of the usual process is to look and see what policies were or were not followed. And then second, asking what policies do we need to update to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So they are still in the process of doing that, but beyond that, I don't have any more details than that.
So one of the reasons this caught my attention is the state's Children's Division, particularly in St. Louis, has had a lot of trouble attracting and retaining investigators. And part of that is that the salary, the starting salary is pretty low, $43,000 a year. Now, it's gone up.
Right.
We had State Representative Carrie Engel on the show, who was an investigator. And when she was an investigator, she was getting paid in the high 20s. So I want to make it clear that there has been momentum to increase the salaries. But $43,000 to do what a children's investigator does, it's not enough money. And we'll get to that reasons why in a minute. But the bigger reason why, especially in the St. Louis area, even if they can get somebody in the door as an investigator, why they typically leave is that the workload is just too much. And that leads to a scenario in this clip from Children's Division Director Daryl Missy about having to triage certain complaints.
You have some triage going on, obviously, because you've got things that are crimes and are emergent, you put on the front burner. And then, the dirty house case, the educational neglect case, those things may take some more time because you're not thinking somebody's going to be harmed today because of that. So it runs that gamut, and they investigate all of that, and they have to, like you said, they have to talk to the person who is reporting. They have to see the child. They have to talk with the parents. They have to investigate things and find out what really happened, and that is an involved process that takes some time.
So you mentioned we don't have all the details about where DSS was in the situation or where the Children's Division was. But are you concerned that this is the nightmare scenario that a lot of child welfare advocates have been worried about, that there are so few investigators and they have so little ability to look into cases that you have a situation where somebody was being abused and they died.
Absolutely. As a social worker myself, I work in behavioral health at a safety net hospital in downtown Kansas City. I have had a caseload of adults myself in the past. And so I know that, 12 to 20 people is a pretty decent sized caseload. And we're talking about people in our state workers having caseloads over 100. That's insanity to think that they can do what they are called to do. And that's squarely on the legislature and on other branches of government for not giving not only the workers, but also just our system what they need. And so I think, in my mind, addressing it and throwing more money at it, which is what we need. We need to pay workers more. We need to, in my mind, we haven't even budgeted the right amount of workers. I think we could use hundreds more budgeted positions in order really to address these issues the way that we need to it. But it's a little bit like putting a battery in a smoke alarm while the house is on fire. And we need to really take a cold hard look at what we've done in the past. And over the last 2 decades, clearly we have not done enough. And then really look upstream and figure how can we, in a more preventative way, build a system that catches people sooner and catches kids sooner.
So you serve on the House Budget Committee. Do you think that there's momentum to significantly raise salaries for the Children's Division, particularly for investigators?
I know that there is among quite a few. I would say that there's still a chunk of legislators that feel like we have already done enough. Just recently, I've heard some say, brag that we spend millions of dollars on kids, and so we should applaud ourselves on the back for that. And that's true. We do spend that much. But when you look at how that money trickles down, that how thinly that money is spread, and then in turn how our workers are spread so thin, we really have not done nearly enough to address this, especially considering, we are toward the top in our country of the amount of kids that are in foster care. If we had the national average, we'd have about 7,000 kids in foster care right now, and we have over 12,000. And so again, what we're doing is not working. The house is on fire, and we need to look at really being honest with ourselves and understanding that from a moral perspective, what we have invested in our kids is not enough because the results are not giving us what we should be getting.
So if let's just say the legislature raises the starting salary from $43,000 to, let's just say, $55,000, do you think that's going to be enough to incentivize people to apply to be investigators?
I think it could. I mean, we are talking about really hard jobs. So I think we also need to look at how we are training our staff and incentivizing them to stay on those jobs as they become more difficult. In the agency that I work in, I help with our workforce, and so just understanding recruitment and retention of staff is just as important as what you pay them. And so looking at making sure that people are trained and that they understand how the jobs are done. And that's something else I think that's an important point is even in areas where we are fully staffed or where we're close to being fully staffed, caseloads are high because those new staff still have to be trained by the existing staff. And so the existing staff still have the high caseload as they're also having someone else shadow them on the job. And I know here in Kansas City that's certainly an issue. And, it's really, these are the kinds of jobs that take about 2 years to really understand and do completely autonomously, because social work is a pretty gray field. Every person is different. And so you really have to go through enough experiences to be able to understand how to address each issue. And when you have staff leaving after 2 weeks of training or after 3 months of shadowing, that's a lot of time investment and money investment that's been made, and then we're losing them and having to train them all over, and then we're exhausting our existing staff.
Well, here's the reason I asked that question. One of the things that DSS officials have told me is a real problem in terms of retention. We're going to get a little in the weeds here, but I think it's a really important point to make. Good. Okay. The reason why it's difficult to retain a lot of investigators is they see a lot of opportunities in the private sector are with DSS contractors, where they get paid more money and their workload is more manageable. And even if you raise the salary significantly, it's never going to reach the point where they're not going to want to work at a hospital or work for a DSS contractor. So I know that's a really difficult problem to solve, but is that something that you're hearing as well as one of the issues with retaining and recruiting some of these people that look into child abuse?
Well, 100%, yes. I mean, you mentioned the private sector. A lot of companies are hiring social workers, even not the licensed clinical social workers, but licensed master social workers, to come in and provide staff wellness training or to do, kind of group therapy, and paying them a lot more to do things that aren't as strenuous as going into someone's home and having a parent scream at you, or going into a home that might have bed bugs. And so, yes, I think that's definitely an issue, is how can we make these jobs more attractive and draw people in that feel the calling, but also recognizing that it's not public service like being an elected official is public service. I didn't run to have this be my only source of income. I still work outside the legislature. But sometimes I think we treat our state workers who are out there doing real hard jobs, and we're expecting them to do it for peanuts because it's a publicly funded job, but they're doing really hard things and they deserve to be compensated for those. And we're never going to keep those positions filled if we don't look at it more seriously.
I talked with Senator Mary Elizabeth Coleman for the story I mentioned before. And one of the things that she has suggested beyond, and I think she's fully in support of paying existing investigators more money. Yeah. And I want to make it clear, she is not in favor of turning investigations over to a private entity, which you can't do right now. Right. The state does not allow that. Right. But what she has proposed, and in this situation, it seems like this would have some validity to it, is contracting with some private entity to go check on the safety of children, because right now investigators can't do that all the time.
I definitely think that that's something that could be looked at, because right now, when you think of all of the cases just piling up on a desk, you're going to go with the ones that are most extreme, where kids are most in the most danger. And so, seeing someone being violent toward their child is going to be put above maybe somebody driving by somebody's house and it seeming dirty. But when we don't go by, but the longer that those cases go on, where someone is not laying eyes on a kid, then the longer they are living it, perhaps in a situation or an environment where that is not as healthy for them. And we know, from studies on first childhood experiences, or ACEs, as we call them for short, the longer that kids experience those, the more that kids experience those, the longer their long-term healthcare complications just continue to grow. And so I think it's definitely a proposal that I'm certainly willing to look at. I hope that others will be willing to look at as well.
We'll be right back after this quick break with State Representative Aaron Crossley.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
And we're back on Politically Speaking with State Representative Aaron Crossley. He is a Democrat from Independence. So by the time this episode is posted to the interwebs, so to speak, it'll be either a day before or it will be the day of session starting. And I've said this in other shows. I have covered sessions intimately. I have covered sessions from afar for the last 16, 17 years. I have never seen expectations so low for a session as 2024. And a lot of that is because it's an election year, a lot of people running against each other, but also just that there's not obvious issues to go after, as we'll kind of talk about. Is my pessimism warranted?
Well, I'm still new to this job. I just finished my first term last year, getting ready to start my second. And from what I've seen from afar, it seems like we might not get very much done. But also from what I'm hearing from people that have been around longer than I have, they're feeling pretty pessimistic too. In general, as I look through the list of bills that have been pre-filed, to say that they seem more extreme or just more, culture war oriented feels like an understatement. And I don't think that my opinion is unlike other people who have been around longer. And of course, I don't know any better. People said that this last session was pretty strange and pretty odd, and I don't know anything different because that's all I've done. I have heard other people say, people that have been around the Capitol, they would be surprised if 10 policy bills get passed this year. That might be a little bit heavy-handed in its assessment, but I do think that we'll see a lot of bargaining going on with things that most Missourians would support, but that people, especially in the Senate, are filibustering, or people in the House are adding language to that makes it more extreme and not passable. And I think, there are those of us that are going to continue to work to get stuff done, but I do have some fear that I'm not going to be able to get a lot across the finish line.
Well, let's talk about one of the possibly 10 bills that needs to be passed. Okay. And also, I want to just tell our listeners, I'm sorry that my voice has just suddenly collapsed midway through this interview. But this is the realities of radio. So, but the issue that has to pass is the reauthorization of the federal reimbursement allowance. And for our listeners, and I'm sure that you know a lot about it because you mentioned you work for a hospital, but this is a tax that hospitals put on themselves that helps pay for the state's Medicaid program. And this is a must-pass bill. And when I mentioned State Representative Carrie Engel, she thinks you're all going to have to go back into special session just like 2021 because it could get intermingled with like abortion politics or horse trading somewhere else. What's kind of your thought about this must-pass piece of legislation?
I share that concern that Representative Engel has. I remember when it was up for renewal the last time and reaching out and advocating for people to pass it. It used to be non-controversial. It used to be just something that was almost ceremonial in reauthorizing because, again, like you said, it's a tax that hospitals put on themselves. They put into it, they pay into it so that they can then be compensated for uncompensated care. And it's something that shouldn't be controversial. I think people understand that hospitals deserve to be paid because when they're not paid, then people can't receive care. And, that's my fear. I've heard that some folks are wanting to bring the FRA up first and get it out of the way before session really gets into full swing. My fear with that is that then that puts everything else on the FRA passing. And so people that want to make political points to get recorded on the House website so that they can then pull those and put them on their campaign websites. I worry that it'll be used as a bargaining chip, but I hope that my newfound pessimism since joining the legislature is unfounded there.
Well, the last time, the reason why it was so difficult for it to pass last time was some senators wanted to place amendments on it that either dealt with like funding for Planned Parenthood or certain forms of contraception. And that was a time when abortion was still technically legal in Missouri. It's illegal except for medical emergencies now. So what exactly would they be able to put on an FRA relating to abortion that would mean anything, basically?
I think that's tough to suss out just because also abortion will be on the ballot probably in August next year as well. But we have to keep in mind it's also an election year. It's a time when especially in the majority party where they're going to the as far right of the party to win primaries as they can. And so I think even if it doesn't make sense, just doing it for the political points, unfortunately, that's really been the most disappointing part of being in the legislature so far, It's just seeing people who don't even agree with it personally, but they do it for the public accolades and stuff.
So one of the things that House Speaker Dean Plocher said at his last press conference of 2023, and listeners of this show know this, he basically said, we need to pass something to increase the threshold to pass a constitutional amendment, or abortion is going to be legal in this state. Now, you mentioned that you think abortion is going to be on the ballot, abortion legalization is going to be on the ballot in August. But right now, the proponents of the more expansive abortion initiatives that would either go up to fetal viability or no gestational week limit, they haven't even announced what they're going to circulate for signatures. And it's not, at this point, I listened to a podcast with former Senator Claire McCaskill, and McCaskill thinks that time is running out for that to even get on the ballot. So the reason I'm asking that is, if that is taken off the table, does the impetus to pass something to make it harder to amend the Constitution also go away in the legislature?
I think that that's a fair assessment, although I've heard recently that there has been some movement to get that forward. But beyond that, I think no matter what, Missourians think that the current law is too extreme, that having no exceptions whatsoever is beyond what trusting what the medical community says, beyond trusting what women say that they need. So I think that we will see something. I don't think that it's too late. I think that there will be something, just because there is such a will among Missouri voters to lessen the extremity of what the current law states. I think that shocking by the speaker, that statement by the speaker was a little shocking, just in how transparent and honest that was from that side of the perspective. But at the end of the day, Missourians really like the initiative petition process. So I think it will have, even if it's put on the ballot to change it, I think that it will fail pretty handily. And so in my mind, it's just an exercise in futility, and it's really wasting Missourians' time and continuing to debate it in the legislature when it's not something that they're asking us to fix. It's not a problem that needs to be solved.
Because I'll be honest with you, I've talked to a lot of Republicans about this, even people that sincerely believe the Constitution should be harder to amend. Not a single one has told me that they think this will pass. Not a single person. So what's kind of your thought about this?
I think they know how unpopular it is, because I think the important thing about the initiative petition process in general is that it takes the R or the D away from an issue and just puts it before voters. It, in a sense, depoliticizes issues that sometimes become political, and it just asks people what they think about a certain issue, apart from who might be championing it, with a party's letter behind their name. And I think that that's why people like it, but I think that that's why some, especially in the majority party, don't like it, because it's taking some power away from, especially moneyed interests that might be pushing a certain priorities, and it just lets people decide. Now, I have heard one argument against the initiative petition process, that it invites outside money. It invites out-of-state money into the state to try to get initiatives through. But to that, I would question, well, how much out-of-state is funding? How much out-of-state money is funding campaigns and being put into PACs that fund campaigns? I don't think that the money that is coming in to pass these initiatives, or to help pass these initiatives, is any more than what is being put to help campaigns pass.
Well, one of the arguments that I've heard, and I think one that actually does have some validity, is that the IP process has been used by interest groups that want to go around the legislature and want to craft something in their favor. Like, I understand that, like, people voted for recreational marijuana because they want recreational marijuana, but this the system that was created is heavily favored towards existing license holders. Just as, like, if you don't get sports betting done, and they put it in an initiative petition, it may benefit the sports teams, or it may be insanely
favorable to casinos or something like that. So I understand that that's not a reason to get rid of the initiative petition process, but I do want you to address that point.
I think that that's a fair point. I think that could have happened, and especially around the marijuana issue, I agree with the licensing process there. But overall, it's something that's served our state for over 100 years. It's something that people want to keep, and at the end of the day, I'm going to trust voters to make the right decision. And at a time when politics is so divided, taking an issue or two and kind of pulling them out to look at them and getting it done that way, I think it's something that the people and voters are asking us for, and I don't think that we should take it away because that's what they want.
My last question for you is based off something you mentioned at the beginning of this segment, and you saw that like a lot of bills have been filed to exacerbate culture war issues. At the beginning of 2023, I don't think people would have predicted that banning gender-affirming care for minors was going to be as big as it was. And I think it's important for us, especially as reporters, to kind of pinpoint some of the things that may not seem top of mind now that could become bigger issues down the road.
I think gender-affirming care is one of those issues that first comes to mind when you ask that question. Last year, it passed, but with some provisions to make it a little bit more palatable to some folks. So the grandfather clause that grandfathered in kids that were already receiving treatments, it put a sunset on that law. And so some of the first bills that you saw filed for next session were to get rid of the sunset, to get rid of the grandfathering clause. Last year, some of the discussion on the floor, from what I could hear, people, some proponents of the bills that passed also brought up the fact that people's brains aren't fully formed until 25, and so why are we letting minors make these decisions for themselves, which is kind of not exactly true way to say that, because also parents are involved in those decisions. But I think that was also setting the stage for limiting it for some adults as well. And we already saw that. That's not outside of what could happen. We already saw that happen with Andrew Bailey and the rules that he set last year on that. I think we'll also see we'll continue to see some attacks on public education through different what some people call school choice measures. I've already seen some bills along those lines. Bills attacking higher education, particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which in this day and age, whether people agree with DEI or not, that is a very common business practice. So it also attacking what businesses can do. I think we will continue to see some of that, and we are seeing that in some of the legislation that has passed or that has been filed, excuse me. And then, I also think of the mRNA bill that was filed last year and took up a lot more attention than what people, I think, thought. But you had some fringe groups even showing up at people's homes and threatening their children over passing this bill, saying that our food is being poisoned by farmers, when I think that is absolutely an insane and a preposterous thing to say. So I think we're going to keep seeing these things that really put fear above reality. And when we try to push policies that are based on fear and not on reality, we get a lot of extreme things that aren't addressing issues that aren't actually happening. And I really would love to see us get back to focusing on roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals.
Well, Representative, thank you so much for joining us on Politically Speaking. And assuming that you win re-election in 2024, which we established on the front end is not a sure thing because you're in a competitive district, we'll have you back in subsequent years. Politically Speaking is a product of St. Louis Public Radio, which is part of the University of Missouri system. You can read all of our political coverage at stlpr.org. And Representative, where can we find you on the internet or social media where you want to be found?
Where I want to be found. That's an important disclaimer there. You can find me at aaroncrossley.com. That's AARONCROSSLEY. Or you can also find me on basically every social media outlet.
Thank you very much, and so long.
Politically Speaking is produced by Sarah Kellogg, Rachel Lippman, and me, Jason Rosenbaum. The show is edited by Fred Ehrlich. Read all of our coverage at stlpr.org. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Politically Speaking by searching the term Politically Speaking on Apple Podcasts. From St. Louis Public Radio. This is Politically Speaking.